Здравствуйте, я Марина Скорикова, и мы на канале Сапере Ауде. Это проект Школы гражданского просвещения. В разных форматах мы рассказываем о событиях, тенденциях и явлениях глобального мира. На одном из американских семинаров школы незадолго до смерти Збигнев Бжезинский сказал: «Эпоха больших войн закончилась». Неужели стратег ошибся или просто шахматная доска изменилась до неузнаваемости? Насколько американские элиты склонны к саморефлексии и как простые американцы относятся к России? У нас в гостях эксперт школы, советник Билла Клинтона и специалист по русской литературе Тоби Гати. Тоби, большое спасибо за сегодняшний разговор. Это действительно редкая и важная возможность. Начну с первого вопроса. Умер крупнейший стратег, сторонник реальной политики Генри Киссинджер. С одной стороны, его имя связано с жесткой внешнеполитической политикой, с другой стороны, он получил Нобелевскую премию мира за то, что пытался прекратить войну во Вьетнаме. Какое наследство оставил после себя Киссинджер в американской политике и вообще, насколько американские элиты склонны к саморефлексии, к оценке прошлой политики предыдущих лидеров?
There's a very divided opinion about Henry Kissinger. On the one hand, as you said, he opened up relations with China. He had good relations with Russia. He made agreements on the Middle East peace. He was a very broad thinker. He brought the whole sweep of history with him, the 19th century, the system of European states, and he was an advisor to every president in the Cold War period, practically. So he had a huge influence. I have a mixed view of him because what we remember is détente with China and Russia. But in point of fact, his policy was to have better relations with China in order to bring Russia around. It wasn't that all three powers would have good relations. He was always talking about balancing and one against another. But the way he spoke about it, he charmed both the Chinese and the Russians to think that he wanted good relations. But once he saw the fight, the war, really, between Russia and China on the Ussuri River, he said this is an opportunity. And so he took advantage of many, many opportunities that were there. He, in his writing, predicted the disintegration of the USSR. He wasn't happy about that because he thought that the most important thing was strategic stability, meaning nuclear weapons, and that we had to make sure that we didn't go to war. And he was correct in that. That was very important, but it wasn't the only thing in the world. And people have talked about his other policies. A lot of people in a lot of countries felt American policy not as a positive fact, but as part of a bigger game, a world game to balance power. So people in Vietnam, obviously that was a war that went on for a long time. A lot of Americans died. Whether or not that was something that could have been either avoided or certainly shortened. It certainly could have been shortened. And there are a lot of dead Vietnamese and Cambodians who suffered because of it. But that was not Kissinger's focus at the time. Another example of a country that he thought was going in the wrong way was Chile and Allende. And he was very much opposed to that regime there. So there was really a worldview, a very active mind, a brilliant mind, but some of the results were not in the spirit, I would say, of American idealism, certainly, and American, the way we look at ourselves. So I think it was a very mixed view. I can give you an extreme example of why some people think that Kissinger went too far with the balance of power. He wanted a strategic arms agreement with the United States. And at that time, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was being discussed. and that would have let, and did finally let, Soviet Jews emigrate. He thought that pushing that might upset the agreement on strategic arms, and his quote was something that really has to make you think twice. He said that if the Soviet Union was building concentration camps for the Jews, he would still negotiate a strategic arms agreement. And you have to wonder how somebody who himself was Jewish and a refugee from Germany could make such a statement. But power is, America was very powerful and still is very powerful. And how you use that power isn't always in the interests of everybody. It can't be. And so he had to make choices. And some of the choices he made, maybe I wouldn't have made it, but maybe some of the good things he did I wouldn't have been able to do either. So it's really a quite mixed view of him.
Спасибо. Еще один эксперт. И, конечно, большое вам спасибо за то, что многие американские политики, дипломаты высокого уровня попали на семинары школы. И вот один из гостей, спикеров американского семинара школы, Збигнев Бжезинский. Да. Хочу немножечко поговорить о нем. На одном из последних семинаров, в котором он принял участие, Збигнев сказал, что эпоха больших войн закончилась. Потом, к счастью, он не увидел, что началось, но неужели стратег ошибся, или та шахматная доска, о которой он писал раньше, изменилась сейчас до неузнаваемости?
I knew Zbigniew Brzezinski much better. I knew him personally. I was actually his research assistant, and when I was at Columbia University, and my major at that time was Russian literature, but I worked with him, and he was also a brilliant man. He was a different kind of man. He never wanted to be a Kissinger, and he was not. He had a much broader view of the world. I know the image of him as being anti-Soviet, which I view as not true. His book about Russia, about Central Europe, because both Kissinger and Brzezinski came from Central Europe, Germany, Kissinger, and Poland for Brzezinski. His view really was that there was an alternative to the Cold War, and he actually wrote a book called Alternative to Partition in 1964, 1965, well, in the 1960s. And his view was, yes, do open up ties, do open up contacts with the countries of Central Europe. We should do that. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union saw that as a threat, not as an opportunity, and his reputation as a Cold Warrior was set. But he was a much broader thinker. He would think not only about China and Russia, but about issues. He wrote a book on technology and what was happening. He wrote a book on Japan. He wrote many articles and books that looked forward to a different kind of American policy. Of course, he called the Third World a global political awakening, and he said that those countries were not going to be quiet, and we were going to have to deal with them, and we couldn't deal with them in the same way that we dealt with China and we dealt with the Soviet Union, and he was correct in that. As he got older, he wrote more about America. Kissinger never really wrote about America. He wrote about America as an actor, but Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote about American problems. And he saw those problems, and it troubled him very much because he thought American leadership was a very positive force and was also something that could only be positive if America remained a strong country, a united country, faithful to its democratic norms. And he was very, very concerned about that. Mm-hmm. If you look at the political situation now, I would say this: Kissinger would have no problem working for any president. Any president. And if Trump had won, which would have been obviously a terrible outcome from my point of view, he probably could have advised him to. Brzezinski never could have. He would have said that's too far, a step too far, and he wouldn't have been able to do it. He, unfortunately, was seen in Russia as anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, perhaps because he was a Polish Catholic, perhaps because he spoke with a different kind of language than Kissinger. It wasn't about balance so much. And he's very well known for his policy recommendations on Ukraine. And on Ukraine, he proposed two ideas, actually. The first was Finlandization, that Ukraine should accept a status like Finland. Well, first of all, that angered the Finns, who don't think of themselves as having lost to the Russians, and actually they won a war against the Soviets before the outbreak of the Second World War. But he thought that it would avoid a war, and it would give the Ukrainians most of what they wanted. But then it was overtaken by the statement he made, which has become, I think, the most true statement about Ukraine that has been made in the last couple of years. And that was, with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. And I think Americans may not have understood this, but certainly Russians did. And I think that's what we're seeing play out in Ukraine. And in order to make that vision true, Putin is prepared to destroy Ukraine if that's necessary. And that is an outcome that is terrible for certainly the Ukrainians, who deserve a lot better and do deserve their independence. But it's also a terrible outcome for the world, because it's impossible to have normal relations with Russia during such a war as we see, and I'm not sure it'll be any easier after such a war. And this is an outcome that nobody could have predicted, except Zbigniew Brzezinski did, by saying Russia can't be an empire without Ukraine. And unfortunately, Russia's mentality is still the desire to be an empire.
Продолжая разговор, коль уж мы начали про войну в Украине, несмотря на старания популистов, в американском обществе большинство поддерживает оказание военной помощи Украине. Насколько меняется, на ваш взгляд, среди американцев отношение к этой войне? И меняется ли настроение, меняется ли общественное мнение?
The American people strongly support Ukraine for several reasons. One is the unexpected timing of the war and the cruelty of the war. We all know that war is death and destruction, but most people had not expected war crimes and had not expected the kind of war that we're seeing now. It's a cruel war. It's deliberately cruel. It's meant to harm civilians. It involves sending prisoners to fight, sending people who would never be allowed into a normal military in any country. It involves some norms that American forces never have. American forces, when they fight, they never leave anyone behind, never, even their dead comrades. And what we see in Ukraine is a totally different kind of war. And it's a war against all. And I think that is shocking to Americans. But having said that, it's not a war of America's choice. America has had wars that it has chosen. Vietnam was one of them. And I don't think Americans certainly would send their own troops to Ukraine, but Ukraine isn't asking for that. Ukraine is asking for our support. I think Ukraine will continue to get that support, but it's getting harder and harder because the amount of money that's needed is enormous. Other countries are also contributing, but it's going to be a long war. And Americans are often forget their own history. They will say, well, we came and we rescued Europe during World War II. Well, that's true, but it's not the case that we voluntarily wanted to enter World War II. We were attacked in Pearl Harbor. And once we were attacked, we went to war. If you look at the history in the 1930s, there were many people who didn't want to get involved in European problems. They see Europe as a continent that can never be at peace with itself. And why should we be involved? And that's part of American history. So I think we, as Americans, don't always understand our own history. Sometimes we don't see far enough ahead to understand that a Russian victory in Ukraine would not be the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new conflict and a change in the balance in Europe, which would be to the detriment of the United States and to NATO and to the values that we think are important, not to mention the people of Ukraine who deserve a lot better.
Говоря о милитаризации сознания, как вы относитесь к возвращению в политику безопасности понятия врага, то, что мы видели во времена Холодной войны?
Well, the concept of an enemy changes. You can have many enemies. There was an expression in America, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So even countries that are your enemies can become your allies. And that's true. I mean, look at World War II, where all of a sudden Stalin became Uncle Joe. And we were allies. But the concept of an enemy by Kissinger or Brzezinski was a narrow concept. It was the nation state fighting other nation states or balancing them. Now we have many different enemies, and we have them coming from all different directions. We have countries that are falling apart. We have countries that are dissatisfied with their borders. We have the environmental crisis. We have refugee crises. So the question is that enemy you face always going to be a country? And the answer is no. Sometimes it's going to be something in the world happening which can destroy your country as much as can a war. And we're not used to thinking that way. And so the concept of the enemy is very diffuse. A month ago, who would have thought that the main enemy would be Hamas in the Middle East? Where did that come from? Well, we know Hamas was an enemy, but it was one of many, and all of a sudden it became the greatest threat to the survival of Israel. So the concept of an enemy changes. There are many people who would say Russia has made a choice now to pursue policies that force us to consider Russia an enemy. I don't think that's a desirable situation. I don't think it can be a long-term situation. The response to Russia will be to the policies Russia pursues. And so it's not just what America thinks is its enemy, but who thinks America is its enemy. And sometimes you're forced to respond, which is true in Ukraine. And sometimes the response is in response to something your country has done. So the concept of an enemy is a fluid concept, and it's hard to know where the next challenge will come from. I don't think it's helpful, actually, to think about countries as enemies and friends in the same way we used to, because a country that's your friend can have quite different interests and can do things to harm you. And the question is, for example, China, is that our enemy or is that our friend? If you make China an enemy, you are going to disrupt the entire global trading system of the world. China is active in every continent now. So is this a helpful concept or one that is very simple to understand but not very useful for a policymaker?
А если говорить про Россию, какое отношение в американском общественном мнении к России, какие перспективы дальнейших взаимоотношений? По-прежнему продолжать интегрировать Россию в западный мир или отгородиться стеной, как сейчас многие говорят, да, и пусть там происходит все, что хочет?
Well, the image of Russia changes all the time. And there was a period where Russia was our friend. There was a period where Russia was our real enemy. And there was a period where we weren't sure exactly where Russia stood. And much of that reflects Russia's own sense of itself. Does Russia want to be a friend? If being a friend, and that's a bad word actually, a friend, because how many of us have real friends? We have acquaintances, but there's no word in politics for acquaintance. You're either a friend or an enemy, because that's how you present it to a public, I guess. But Russia has its own interests. Increasingly, it is pursuing those interests with countries that are unfriendly to the United States. And if we look at the coalition today, what we have is a Russia that was part of an agreement with Iran to control nuclear weapons, now is a friend of Iran, receiving weapons from Iran, which it is using in Ukraine. North Korea is another example where Russia was part of the UN sanctions against North Korea, and now has just is no longer part of that sanctions plan, which means it can't work, and is looking for weapons from North Korea to use against Ukraine. So it's hard to say that Russia's policies are in any way friendly towards the United States. I think the most problematic one, the one most under question, is the relationship with China, which we look at and we see that Russia and China, having said that they're best friends, I think they should have said that what they are is big brother and little brother, only the role has been reversed from the earlier period when the big brother was Russia and the little brother was China. And it's always been amazing to me and to many people who study Russia that Russia is willing to accept such a subordinate role from China, which has its own objectives in the world, and which at one time was not only an enemy of Russia, the Soviet Union, but actually fought a war. And so I think when we look ahead, the question is, what kind of relations does Russia want with different countries? And it seems, unfortunately, that Russia has made a choice to turn its back on the Western countries and to find allies who I think are not reliable allies, frankly. I mean, there was also, by the way, a war with Iran after World War II. 1/3 of the territory of Iran was taken by the Soviet Union. I don't think the Iranians have forgotten this. So I don't think these are real friends. I think we have to really be concerned about Russia's future path. In America, there's some questioning. How should we treat Russia? Should we welcome Russians to America? Are all Russians to be treated as supporting their government's policy? And I think most Americans understand that nobody asked the average Russian whether they wanted to go to war with Ukraine. Nobody asked them if they wanted to turn away from the West. Nobody asked them if they wanted to send 300,000 troops to Ukraine. And therefore, the distinction between the Russian government and the Russian people remains. And we see a positive attitude towards many of the Russians who come to the West. Some people ask, oh, why aren't you protesting in Russia? Those are the people who don't understand what happens if you do protest in Russia. You're not likely to have a second chance to a second protest. And so I think there's a lot of goodwill towards Russians built up during a period when we had contacts, and a lot of people I know who would love to reestablish contacts. But not only don't we have contacts now, we don't even have a framework for contacts. During the Cold War, we had agreements. We had people coming from all different areas to meet with Americans. I myself had participated in those, have organized them, have supported them. But it's very difficult now to explain to people why Russia is doing what it's doing. And it's a big burden to ask Russians to come to America and criticize their government. Nobody likes to go abroad and do that. But I think Russia's policies have made it more difficult for the average Russian who considers himself part of the world community, part of the Western world, to actually live that life. And that's one of the worst consequences of the war in Ukraine, is what it's done to people in Russia who believed that their country could be living a normal life, connected to the world, part of the world, and still be Russian, which is very important. And there's nobody, myself included, who wants Russians to be less Russian. I wouldn't have spent my whole life studying Russia if I didn't think it was a great civilization and a great country. And there are many people like that. And now we wonder, what happened? What happened to the Putin who said his goal for Russia was to have the standard of living of Portugal? What happened to the Putin who wanted contacts with the West? How did all that turn around? And how is it that the model that we have to think about is not a Russia opening up, but a Russia closing? And not only closing, but closing in a way which makes the experience of the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s something we have to think about. Frankly, I thought those days were over. I think most Americans did, most Russians did, and I think that this too shall pass. The question is when and how.
Спасибо большое за ваше замечание, что есть понимание, что никто не спрашивает россиян, хотят ли они участвовать в войне, потому что это важно отделять правительство от гражданского общества. И в России это действительно так. И здесь я бы хотела переместить наш фокус внешней политики на внутренний, потому что и в России, и в Америке предстоят президентские выборы. В России мы понимаем, что это выборы без выбора. В Америке совершенно другая история. Что американский избиратель сейчас требует от будущего кандидата, на чем фокус, какие основные требования к тому, кто в ближайшее время займет кабинет.
Well, obviously there's quite a big difference between the way America chooses a president and the way Russia chooses a president. We used to joke that the way Russia chose a president was the way God said to Adam in the Garden of Eden, choose yourself a wife. Well, that's what kind of election you're going to have, and there's no doubt what the outcome is going to be. In the United States, elections are not decided on foreign policy unless there's a war. Vietnam was a case, but that was probably the only case where foreign policy wars actually were that important. They're decided on internal issues, usually the economy. Mm-hmm. Do you live better today than you did 4 years ago? Do you think the president cares about you? Americans have a personal relationship with their leaders. What is that leader thinking about in terms of their life? And what people really care about is inflation, mm-hmm. the economy, and two issues which are new. One is abortion, which has become a very important issue because of the decision of the Supreme Court. And it's become a symbol of the right of the individual to choose how they live their life, which is important in every society. But in America, we never have thought about the government telling us how to live our lives. And here it is all of a sudden, a decision which affects many, many women, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and it's become a very, very big issue in the campaign. And the second issue is the role of government in your life. Now, in America, we've never had a socialist state. We've never had full medical insurance for everybody. We've always had people who say, I can take care of myself, or my state can take care of me, or my community can. And in general, that is true. That is how people live. But we also live in a much more complex world than we used to live in, and the government does a lot more. The government decides trade policy, tariffs. President Biden has had bills passed Congress which are for infrastructure, which means all bridges, roads, many of them will be rebuilt. Wonderful policies, but these come from the federal government, as did our highway system. That was done actually as a defense act. President Eisenhower said, we have to have a good system of roads, not because we need good roads, but in case we have to move tanks, we have to have a road system. So even for that, you had to explain why the federal government was doing something for the states in terms of national issues. So it really is, the issues are not going to be foreign policy, except in the sense of why are we spending money on others instead of on ourselves? And that's hard to explain to people. It's much easier to explain after you don't help people and there's a war and you say, well, you know, we could have prevented this, but we weren't interested. But it's just hard to say to someone, I know you can't pay the rent, and I know you can't send your child to preschool, but we have to help Ukraine. Or any other issue, any other country. The United States is a very generous country. It gives a lot of money in foreign aid, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I would say that the amount that Russia or the Soviet Union gives is probably 5% of what America gives. So I don't want to hear lectures about how America is turning its back on the world. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, in the refugee camps, that's American money, most of it. It's not Russian money. It's not Chinese money. If they want to criticize America, then spend their own money. So I'm very impatient with people who say America is not generous. It is generous. It does care. But it's also a country surrounded by oceans. And there's no reason for us to think that America is going to be invaded, except that the new technologies are such that you don't have to be invaded by ships and armies. You can be invaded by computer malfunctions, by malware, by all kinds of disinformation, and there's no way to prevent that. So we are connected to the world, and you have to explain that to people. I think Biden has been a very good president. I'm not concerned at all that he's older. Trump isn't much younger. Trump spent 500 days of his presidency on the golf course. If people want to have a professional golfer for president, you know, there he is. And I think he's tried to do many, many things that are very, very positive. Should Trump be the candidate? I think it would show a failure of the American judicial system, because there are so many cases in which it is clear, to me at least, that he's violated American law, that he's not upheld the oath as president, and I believe a second term would be bad not only for Americans, because he has said some things about the kind of system he would like, which remind you more of the Russian system than they do of an American democratic system, but he also would be an unreliable ally in Europe, especially, and very unpredictable, and surrounded by people who were angry that the first term didn't produce the results it could. So I think it would be a tragedy, not just for America, but for the world. And fortunately, there are now many people who believe that you cannot just depend on your institutions. you have to fight for them, and you have to be alert, and you have to understand that our form of government is not given to us, and you can just go about your life. You have to work at the local level, you have to work at the national level to make sure American democracy remains strong.
Спасибо большое, Тоби, и за наш сегодняшний разговор, и за вашу помощь в школе.
My
Спасибо.
pleasure. Thank you.